under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt rapidly make major territorial gains. Tactics play an important role.
Of all the armed forces in the Second World War, the Wehrmacht proves most adept at launching combined arms operations, especially in the early stages of the war. That means coordinating service branches so that they mesh and work together, like teeth in a gearbox.
Wie in einem Getriebe die Zähnchen in sich greifen.
A key role is played by aerial reconnaissance, which is generally performed by Dornier 17s and Henschel 126s. The crews take photographs, which are then minutely analyzed on the ground. A propaganda film documents their work.
Geschulte Fachoffiziere und Mannschaften ermöglichen durch gute Arbeitsteilung die strategische und taktische Auswertung der von den Aufklärern eingebrachten Beute. Das entwickelte Material gibt der Führung wichtige Unterlagen für Planung und Durchführung weiterer Operationen.
The advancing German armies leave behind a trail of devastation. On the 3rd of September, a soldier in the 14th Army notes in his diary, "The routes of the advancing divisions are easy to identify. On our way to the front, we pass endless streams of civilians and burning homes. The fields near the road are littered with the bizarrely twisted corpses of Polish civilians. We all look, but few grimace. Everyone just thinks it's war." For many of the inexperienced German soldiers, the distinction between civilians and partisans becomes blurred.
In the campaign against Poland, German abuses, German crimes are committed at a very early stage. In the Wehrmacht, it's primarily because soldiers are nervous and inexperienced and fear an ambush at every turn. They are quick to overreact. They set whole villages on fire and they kill hostages.
Man weiß nicht, ob es tatsächlich so eine Art
We don't know whether there really was some kind of guerrilla war in Poland, but the Wehrmacht certainly came to believe they were caught up in one. Then they started shooting at anything that moved.
Angst, dass auf alles schossen, was sich nur irgendwie bewegte.
Apart from these acts of violence, there is early evidence of ideologically motivated crimes against Polish civilians.
It is a war of annihilation from the outset, a war aimed at the absolute decimation of the Polish nation. Einsatzgruppen, SS death squads, are operating behind the Wehrmacht lines, and the result is the murder of at least 60,000 civilians, politicians, clerics, and academics, many of them members of the Jewish faith.
At the outbreak of the Second World War, Jews make up around 10% of the Polish population. Before long, that minority becomes a focus for the Einsatzgruppen and a victim of excessive violence. National Socialist propaganda has demonized Jews for years and seeks to stir up hostility even more. Propaganda films and newsreels become vehicles for incitement campaigns specifically targeting Jews.
Dieses ostjüdische Untermenschentum hat seit jeher Westeuropa das internationale Verbrechergesindel geliefert. Von hier aus wurden die Demokratien mit Taschendieben, Zuhältern, Rauschgift- und Mädchenhändlern, internationalen Bankschiebern und Hetzjournalisten versorgt. Das sind dieselben Juden, deren Brüder, Söhne und Vettern in London und Paris für die Humanität und Zivilisation das große Wort führen.
5 Einsatzgruppen, with a total of around 3,000 men, were initially formed for the Polish campaign. While they commit murder behind the front line, the German armed forces press on with their advance. On the 6th of September, the 10th Army significantly breaches the Polish defenses. The Polish High Command orders its troops to retreat behind the San, Bug, and Weichsel rivers. The same day, German units take numerous cities in the south of Poland, including Tarnow. The ground force benefits from a new form of support from the air.
Back in the First World War, the air arm's primary function was reconnaissance. Now planes are used to provide tactical support for troops on the ground, a new idea that is embraced only by the German Wehrmacht in the early war years.
In the invasion of Poland, the Wehrmacht deploys 2 air fleets with over 1,100 aircraft. Particularly feared are the Stukas, the German dive bombers. As they dive, they make a screaming sound that terrifies and undermines morale.
Zurück im Einsatzhafen sind unsere Stukas einige 100 Kilo leichter. Aber das verlorene Gewicht wird wieder ausgeglichen. Ran mit einer neuen Bombe!
Each Stuka can carry a payload of 1,800 kilos, and it's feared by soldiers and civilians alike. On the home front, the military successes in the early days of the war are followed with keen interest. Newspapers put out special issues reporting on developments at the front line. But no one can expect the truth here. The press has been under National Socialist control for years. The same goes for radio, but despite censorship, the dark side of the war quickly becomes apparent. Trainloads of casualties arrive from the front line. Military hospitals and infirmaries spring up all over the country. Here, a converted school at Korbach in Hesse. An amateur filmmaker records the busy hospital at work and the surgery that is performed. By the end of the Polish campaign, around 30,000 German soldiers have been wounded and some 15,000 have lost their lives. Before long, scenes like this are an everyday sight in Germany. 21 years after the end of the First World War, fallen soldiers are again laid to rest.
In
the early days of the war, when soldiers killed in action are still returned home for burial, the regime's stage manages the funerals as tributes to heroes.
Ganz klar, des Nationalsozialismus. Auch die ganze Familie
The entire family of the deceased are showcased to put across the message that if something bad like this happens, it is a life sacrificed for the regime. And the regime will not forget the family.
Und das Regime wird die Angehörigen nicht vergessen.
The Nazi propaganda machine prefers to present other images. Since the war started, Adolf Hitler has paid regular visits to troops in the field, and he makes sure they are filmed. Here, the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces salutes German units crossing the River San.
Hitler likes to be seen with the troops during the Polish campaign. He does so primarily for propaganda reasons, of course, to show Germans that their Führer and Chancellor is now also a soldier. He knows what it's like. He knows from the First World War what it's like to be a simple serviceman on the front line. And for the troops, the message is, he is with you. The attention is to boost morale, of course, and strengthen the bond between members of the armed forces and their Führer and Supreme Commander.
The Betsura River near Kutno in central Poland. Undetected by German reconnaissance, parts of the Polish Pomorze and Poznan armies join forces here and confront the advancing Germans. For a while, the German 8th Army under General Blaskowitz finds itself hard-pressed by the Polish offensive. But with the help of parts of the 4th and 10th Armies, the Polish forces are ultimately surrounded. On the 19th of September, the battle is won. Around 170,000 Polish soldiers become German prisoners of war and thus face an uncertain future.
Crimes against the civilian population and against prisoners of war are documented from a fairly early stage in the Polish campaign. I think ideology certainly played a part, but there is also what you might call a cultural divide. As in the First World War, Poles are seen as culturally inferior. It's a fairly old perception with the potential to arouse and unleash violence. And above all, The Nazi regime and Wehrmacht institutions do nothing to curb that violence.
Eine Institution, die eben auch gegen diese Gewalt nicht vorgehen.
What is more, the Wehrmacht cannot cope from the outset with the large number of prisoners. On the 8th of September, the 7th Army Corps of Army Group South reports that conditions behind the rapidly advancing ground force are appalling. More than 6,000 prisoners and internees are entirely without food and virtually unguarded. A total of 400,000 Polish soldiers fall into German captivity during the campaign. Many of them are later deported and forced into slave labor. On the 17th of September, the Polish armed forces suffer another heavy blow. The Red Army invades from the east.
Mit dem Angriff der Roten Armee auf
When the Red Army crosses the border on the 17th of September, it's effectively game over for Poland. The country cannot possibly win a war on two fronts. There might have been a chance of staying off defeat if there was only one front, but even that would have been difficult. And the events of the 17th of September can mean only one thing. It's every man for himself.
In the protocol to the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Third Reich and the Soviet Union divided up Poland between them and defined the Bug River as the demarcation line. Within days of the Red Army entering Poland, the invaders meet at Brest-Litovsk and mark their success with a celebratory joint military parade. Less than 2 years later, Wehrmacht and Red Army troops will meet again, but as enemies after Germany invades the Soviet Union in June 1941. The outcome of the war in Poland has been decided, but the fighting is not yet over. Military action is now focused on the battle for the capital. Warsaw has been surrounded since the 13th of September, but German troops have so far failed to take the city. American filmmaker Julian Bryan is one of the last foreign journalists present in Warsaw in September. His camera records the people's desperate attempts to protect their city.
The Germans start to wonder if they'll surrender. A short, sharp offensive fails. Before long, German tanks are outside Warsaw, but they are kept at bay by the Poles. The question now is, how can the Poles be made to surrender?
The Luftwaffe provides the answer. On the 25th of September, more than 1,500 missions are flown over Warsaw. Over 500 tons of high explosive and dozens of tons of incendiary bombs are dropped by wave after wave of aircraft. Operation Wasserkante, Waterfront, is based on a plan of attack developed by the Luftwaffe before the war.
Für das Ende des Krieges ist sie sicherlich eminent wichtig.
It is eminently important for the end of the war, because the German army does not relish the prospect of a long house-to-house fight for Warsaw. Wasserkante enables it to break the defenders' spirit, but it also means the civilian population suffers.
Der Zivilbevölkerung.
Large parts of the city are razed to the ground. No distinction is made between civilian and military targets. Julian Bryan films the devastation at a hospital that fell victim to the bombing. The nursery ward was evacuated in time. Other people in the city were not so lucky. More than 25,000 people are killed. A propaganda film presents the Nazi version of events, blaming the Poles for the inferno. They should have surrendered the city earlier. The commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, boasts about the air arm's achievement.
Diese Luftwaffe hat hier Leistungen vollbracht, die für immer unvergänglich sein werden. Als einst in Versailles dem deutschen Volk diese herrliche Waffe genommen wurde, da ahnte man nicht, dass unter der Führung Adolf Hitlers diese Waffe neuer, stärker und mächtiger wieder entstehen würde.
2 months later, the top brass of the Luftwaffe deliver a triumphant report on the bombardment. They speak in particularly glowing terms about the incendiary bomb B-1 Fe. The resounding success of the Warsaw operation removes any doubt about its outstanding efficacy in residential areas, they say. It was dropped in large quantities to maximize the number of fires and interspersed with waves of high explosive and shrapnel bombs to keep the population in shelters so that fires can spread to catastrophic levels. Only a few years later, the same strategy will be used against German cities. Allied bombers will fly similar missions, fully aware that tens of thousands of civilians will perish.
Blanket bombing always targets civilians. The point is that this is the first time it was used in the Second World War. It's also perhaps important to note that it was not the British or Americans who ordered the first bombing raids. The first blanket bombing was carried out by the German Luftwaffe.
In theory, the German bombardment may have been compliant with the Hague Land Warfare Convention. Warsaw was a defended city in a combat zone with substantial fortifications. In effect, the assault was a terror attack. Within hours, the city commander announces Warsaw's unconditional surrender. 120,000 soldiers in the city are now taken into German captivity, every moment captured on film by a Nazi propaganda team.
Mit Mann und Ross und Wagen.
Quoting a poem about Napoleon's ultimate defeat, the narrator stresses the scale of the Polish capitulation. The Polish defense now collapses nationwide. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Marshal Rydz-Śmigł, flees to Romania, following the footsteps of the government, which did the same in the middle of September. Sporadic fighting continues through to the 6th of October, but then all resistance ceases. 36 days after the invasion, the campaign is over. An average of around 1,940 Polish soldiers a day have been killed since the 1st of September. The final death toll is at least 70,000, and the list of wounded runs to 130,000. Apart from that, thousands of civilians have been murdered.
The brutalization of war is seen clearly in the invasion of Poland, and I think it is a very significant development, one that has rightly been highlighted by research in recent years. We see here the suspension of inhibitions against violence, also on the part of the military and individual soldiers, which will be a hallmark of the subsequent war with the Soviet Union.
The day before the last Polish units surrender, the Wehrmacht holds a victory parade in Warsaw in the presence of its supreme commander. The dictator enjoys the moment of triumph, but he is already making new plans for war.
What Hitler really wants to do after the Polish campaign is immediately launch a strike against France. But the army and its commander-in-chief, Walter von Brauchitsch, persuade him the time is not right. Winter is coming, we have no more bombs, and we have no more fuel. Hitler has no real idea what a desperate state the armed forces are in.
Victory in the Polish campaign masks the Wehrmacht's problems, which have become increasingly acute in recent weeks.
The ranks of the Wehrmacht swell from 100,000 men in 1933 to 2.6 million in 1939. That's a 40-fold increase in manpower within a few years, and it can only be achieved, of course, by significantly lowering recruitment standards. The Wehrmacht has endless problems in Poland. Advances and shelling in the wrong direction, action taken without consultation. It is a poorly prepared fighting force with significant shortcomings and massive problems. And it is only victorious in Poland because the chaos is even greater on the Polish side.
Tactical errors aside, the Wehrmacht has major supply problems. It is a far cry from the super army presented in the newsreels.
Even this fairly brief military campaign against Poland pushes the arms industry to its limits. Internal communications in winter 39-40 speak of a munitions crisis. It's an extraordinary situation. Parts of the Wehrmacht don't have enough grenades or ammunition. There's a shortage of bombs, and there are supply problems.
Dass es an Bomben fehlt, dass es Probleme beim Nachschub gibt.
The dictator responds to the crisis. At Hitler's instigation, a Ministry for Armaments and Munitions is created, and engineer Fritz Todt is appointed to head it. He had previously made a name for himself developing the Autobahn network.
Eine wichtige
An important solution to the munitions crisis is found, again with Hitler's intervention, by defining the areas on which armament should focus in the future. They are air armament, that is, aircraft construction, and the manufacture of ammunition. These are the two areas defined as crucial to the war effort.
Absolut zentral und im Mittelpunkt zu stehen habend festgelegt sind.
Just days after the Polish surrender, headlines are dominated by a feat of naval warfare. On the 17th of October, the submarine U-47, under the command of Günther Prien, enters the port of Kiel after a successful patrol. It has just attacked the British naval base at Scapa Flow.
In October 1939, when there's nothing newsworthy happening on the front lines, a German U-boat commander, Günther Prien, manages to penetrate the Scapa Flow defenses and sink an old British battleship, the Royal Oak. The bay in the far north of Scotland is the main base of the British naval fleet and a place with special significance for the German Navy. After the First World War, the German High Seas Fleet was interned in Scapa Flow and in 1919 was scuttled on the orders of its own commander. 2 decades later, Nazi propaganda goes into overdrive over the U-boat captain's achievement. He is the propaganda machine's dream. Nazi propaganda teams are always on the lookout for personal stories and images. An infantryman crouching in a trench is not a story I can tell. But I can tell stories about achievers. So submariners are hailed as heroes by the propaganda machine. They tick all the boxes. They are young and dynamic. They are valiant fighters. Unlike the grey ranks of the army and infantry, they are perfect for inspiring the young.
Anders als bei der grauen Masse des Heeres und der Infanterie.
Footage like this boosts the number of volunteers for submarine service. U-boat crews see themselves as a naval elite, but the majority of the men will pay for their delusion with their lives. Around 3/4 of all servicemen assigned to German U-boats do not live to see the end of the war. In Poland, after the military campaign is over, millions of people lose their homes. As early as the beginning of October, Hitler announced in the Reichstag that hundreds of thousands of ethnic Germans would be resettled in the west of Poland, and the ethnographic situation adjusted. The resettlement areas are cleared, existing communities brutally expelled. The Polish state is erased from the map.
The Germans' primary objective is to regain the eastern territories that had to be ceded under the Treaty of Versailles and swiftly reincorporate them into Germany. This results in the establishment of 2 new administrative subdivisions, Danzig, West Prussia, and Warthegau, around Poznan. A few smaller areas are also assigned to East Prussia and East Upper Silesia. But the bulk of Polish territory forms a separate zone known as the General Governorate. From the outset, this is intended as a place to deport undesirables.
On the 26th of October 1939, Hans Frank is appointed Governor General. A lawyer by profession and a convinced National Socialist, he takes up office in Wawel Castle in Krakow, once a residence of Polish kings. From the moment he is appointed, Frank pursues a brutal policy of exploitation against the population of the General Governorate.
Was eben mit dazugehörte, war ein Selbstbild.
One of the factors at play here was a national self-image. We are the new master race, and what we say here goes. You are our slaves, and you are here to work for us, to grow food for the German Reich. Apart from that, you are good for nothing.
Ansonsten seid ihr zu nichts nütze.
Es geht nicht darum, das Leben der Zivilbevölkerung in irgendeiner Art.
There is no thought of providing security for the civilian population. The purpose of administration and government is to extract the most from the Poles and secure German authority. Civilian suffering is accepted from the start. If the food situation is bad, if the harvest is poor, let them starve. That is more or less the attitude. Then there is the extremely brutal treatment of the Polish Jews in the General Governorate, and there are around 2 million of them.
In the early weeks of the war, thousands of Jews were murdered by SS death squads. Now, ghettos are created in many Polish cities, their inhabitants overcrowded and exploited. For many, life in these ghettos is the first phase of a harrowing ordeal, one that ends in millions of deaths.
Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit der regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 wird jetzt zurückgeschossen.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them.
On January 13, 1942, a German submarine appeared off the Atlantic coast of the United States. Together with two others, they took up positions near New York City. The group had just completed 2 weeks of travel. Within sight of the Manhattan skyline, the boats went on the attack. The long-range submarines had an easy time of it. U.S. shipping was completely unprepared, assuming that the East Coast was beyond the reach of the Germans. Unprotected, the freighters were at the mercy of torpedoes.
The Germans, after all, had declared war on the U.S. on December 11, 1941. And then the question was how to actually reach the U.S. How could they exert an influence on the US? How could they attack it? The only weapon that Germans had for this were their submarines, and Karl Dönitz, the commander of the submarines, was quite pleased with the opportunity to find new hunting grounds for his submarines. He had rightly assumed that the Americans had peacetime merchant shipping on their east coast, and they were of course very easy to attack with submarines. And so he went 5 submarines at first, then more and more to the American east coast and also to the Caribbean. And there hundreds of ships, or about 2 million gross tons, were sunk in the first half of 1942. This was one of the very great successes of the German Navy. Some go so far as to say that this whole Operation Paukenschlag was a second Pearl Harbor.
In einem Einsatzhafen unserer Unterseeboote. Die ersten Amerikafahrer kehren von erfolgreicher Feindfahrt zurück.
Successes like these were most welcome to Nazi propaganda. The newsreels reported extensively on German U-boat heroes.
Kapitänleutnant Hardegen, dessen Boot unmittelbar vor den Toren New Yorks operierte. Kapitänleutnant Hardegen versenkte bisher 110.400 Bruttoregistertonnen, davon 58.000 Bruttoregistertonnen vor New York. Vizeadmiral Dönitz überreicht dem erfolgreichen Kommandanten das Ritterkreuz.
Of course, Nazi propaganda was always looking for images, for stories, for personalizations. We know all this from today's media technology, and in principle, it was no different with Nazi propaganda. What stories can we tell? An infantryman lying in a trench, firing somewhere. That's not a story I can tell. But if I can measure performance, then I can tell stories, then I can award medals. It's like sports. And that's the case with submariners. How much tonnage did they sink? I can measure military performance. That's why submariners are celebrated as heroes by propaganda. I can sell them well. They're young, they're dynamic, they're fighters. They go for it. So I can generate enthusiasm among the youth, unlike the grey mass of the army and the infantry. And the Navy also plays a much bigger role politically through propaganda than it actually plays militarily.
Spielt sie eigentlich auch politisch eine viel größere Rolle, als sie militärisch eigentlich spielt.
On the other side of the continent, America was suddenly threatened by danger from the deep. On February 23rd, a Japanese submarine appeared off the California coast and shelled a refinery near Santa Barbara. For the first time, the U.S. experienced an attack on its mainland. Japan's militaristic government was making propagandistic profit from the foolhardy attack. Ever since the Imperial Navy succeeded in striking a devastating blow against the most important U.S. naval base in the Pacific in December, the Japanese military had been prone to excessive hubris. But exaggerated claims were also being made in the United States.
In the American press after Pearl Harbor, there was actually, of course, exaggerations. But there was definitely this idea that, yes, it's possible that the Yellow Peril is coming. It was possible that the Japanese could also somehow land on the west coast of America. And this fear did exist. As far as the Japanese were concerned, there was never any thought of somehow trying to make a serious landing attempt on the American continent. There were isolated pinpricks on the California coast. That's where the Japanese Navy had sent submarines. But it was more to send the message, if we wanted to, we could reach you. And if we wanted to, we could attack you here. But we're not doing it. It was the same situation with Australia, although there were also those in the Japanese military who said, the next step must actually be to take Australia. We have taken all of Southeast Asia. It's not enough that we bomb Darwin in the north of Australia. No, we also have to take Australia, because sooner or later Australia represents the most important base for the Americans in the Asia-Pacific region.
Using the Blitzkrieg example of their German ally, Japanese troops had quickly invaded numerous countries in Southeast Asia by December. The Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore were also under their control by January. as were numerous Pacific islands. Now, the Japanese were preparing to seize other Western European colonies such as Burma and the East Indies. Asia for the Asians was their battle cry, but for many Japanese nationalists, it served as a mere pretext for these campaigns of conquest.
Japan's plan was first to wage a very offensive, lightning-fast war in Southeast Asia to conquer as much territory as possible, as quickly as possible, in the Southeast Asia-Pacific region. Then to hold on to these in a second, more defensive phase, then to consolidate, and then to force the Americans and also Great Britain and the West into a negotiated peace if possible on Japanese terms.
The British Crown colony of Hong Kong fell in early December. Japanese forces outnumbered the Empire's colonial troops almost 4-1. They quickly gained air superiority over the city from the Pearl River Delta. Soon, the Allied formations had to retreat. Then, Japanese troops occupied the city. During the so-called Black Christmas, the civilian population endured immeasurable suffering. Arbitrary murders and rapes by the occupiers were the order of the day. Within 4 months, Nippon brought all of Southeast Asia, as well as much of the Pacific Ocean, with about 450 million people under its rule. The Japanese Empire had never been larger. On the other side of the world, people were highly pleased with these developments, even though no one in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin had known about Japan's plans in advance. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler awarded a medal to the imperial ambassador.
General Oshima hat hervorragende Verdienste das Zustandekommen des Drei-Mächte-Paktes, der Deutschland, Italien und Japan nun auch zum gemeinsamen Kampf die Neuordnung Europas und des